Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nikki Evans, and I'm CAFOD's Programme Officer for Bolivia. I've been doing this job for the last 4 years, just over 4 years. For 3.5 of those years, I was actually based in La Paz in Bolivia. And then earlier this year, we decided to move my role back to the UK. So I now work part-time in London in Romero House and part-time in the Leeds office up north. So my mum, when I first moved to South America, thought that Bolivia was in Africa. So I always start my presentation by showing a map of the very wonderful South America. So you can see that Bolivia is right in the middle between Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Paraguay. It's actually a country that's twice the size of France. It's a gigantic country, but it's got a population of about 10.6 million, so it's quite sparsely populated. It's one of the poorest countries in South America, there with Guyana, which is the other extremely poor country in the region. The If you look at the screen to the right-hand side, to the east, most of that section of Bolivia is Amazon lowlands, Amazon basin, and then lowlands. Whereas to the left-hand side, to the west, that region is the Andes Mountains, which are moving up through Chile, passing through Bolivia and up into Peru. And the three projects that I'm going to talk about today that are the focus for Harvest are all based up in this area. In the Andes Mountains, there are two Cordillera of mountains that go up, and then in the middle of that is a very high plateau that's called the Altiplano, and that is at about, on average about 3,750 meters. That's about 12,000 feet above sea level, so it's an extremely high part of the country, and that's where a lot of the most vulnerable and a lot of the poorest people are based, are living, survive on agriculture, so having small family farms. So the big red circle that you can see, that shows the area of the Altiplano where our three partners are working. So two are to the left-hand side. I don't know if you can see, there's a lake there that's called Lake Titicaca. It's the world's highest navigable lake, and it's a lake that Bolivia shares with Peru. So some of our projects are based around that area, and then some are more over to the right-hand side in the mountains there, to the west of Cochabamba. So when people think of Bolivia, they will often think of some of the indigenous people in the country, particularly the ladies. So this is a photo of Susana and her husband Sergio. In Bolivia, there are 36 different indigenous peoples, and the two largest groups are called the Aymara and the Quechua, and they're found up in the Altiplano. And the ladies will often be dressed as Susana is here, so with her bowler hat and with her shawl that will be woven in bright colours. And a lot of the indigenous people living in this area are still living in quite severe poverty. So levels of poverty at the moment are about 45% in the country. But in rural areas, such as the areas where our partners are working, they're actually at 60%. So although over the last 10 years, Bolivia has, its economy started growing, there have been some fantastic programs that the government's been rolling out to pull people out of extreme poverty, there are still people that are being left behind, and those are the people that our partners are working with. So CAFOD in Bolivia. We've been there we've been supporting partners there for over 25 years, and at the moment we're supporting 12 different projects via 10 different partners. The three projects that I'm talking about today are focused on rural agriculture and helping people grow enough food to survive on their land. But we do support a lot of other different work, particularly around human rights, about supporting women, and about supporting democracy. But I'm just going to focus on the agricultural projects for now. So this is a picture of the Altiplano. You'll see the flat lands there, and then the edge of one of the Cordilleras, so the mountain ranges that run alongside it. When our communications team came in January to visit, to take photos and to interview people for Harvest, they came, January should be rainy season, but these are three of the photos that they took. So you can see that rainy season wasn't going well for the families in the regions that we work in at that time. The Altiplano being so high, it means that it's extremely arid. There's not a lot of oxygen, so lots of people struggle with altitude when they come to visit. But because of changing rain's become much more unpredictable. It often doesn't arrive as early as it should. It means there's also not a lot of water, and access to water is a huge problem for the families that we work with. So this is Nicanora. I'm sure some of you will have seen her already in some of the materials that that CAFOD staff have been sharing with volunteers and supporters. I first met Nicanora in January because she's just starting with our projects. She's got 4 children, she's 32 years old, and her husband, because it's so difficult to grow enough food on their land, her husband has to migrate to the city to find temporary work. And that's quite a common situation across the Altiplano. Because they're not able to grow enough food to last all year, that affects the food that she can cook and feed her children. She told us that sometimes she'll buy some vegetables and make them as last as she can, but if there's no money, then they'll just go without. And when that happens, she'll sometimes make barley soup, which will just be ground barley mixed in with water. So life's extremely tough for Nicanora. We're really hoping over the next 2 years as she goes through the project that we'll be able to see that transforming for her. So the main problem that Nicanora faces is insufficient food. So it's hard to grow crops on her land because there's not enough rain, because they don't have enough access to water. And that's not helped by quite unpredictable and challenging climate. So some difficulties from the climate are due to climate changing. So the rain has become much more unpredictable and comes a lot later during the year. And temperatures are rising, so various plagues and illnesses are coming up from the lower lands, and people's usual methods of fighting plagues and diseases, both for their plants and their livestock, those methods aren't working with these new plagues that are coming. Other problems are inherent to the area, so there's often severe frosts kind of around June time. There can be very severe hailstorms, and those are problems that people have always had to deal with. While there's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of clean water either, and so that's causing problems for families and their health. Because there's not enough food and not enough clean water, and there are problems, particularly for the children, with malnutrition. In the areas that we work in, the level of severe malnutrition in children is at about 37%, and that appears in the form of stunted growth. Because people aren't able to grow enough food, it means that they don't really have any income, and although schooling's free, families still need money for materials for the children to attend school, so that can be a big problem for them. And as a result of this, lots of people migrate. So usually the husband in the family will migrate first and will maybe go to the nearest city. So that could be El Alto or La Paz, and they'll work in construction, temporary work in construction, or they may work selling produce in the streets, in the markets. Sometimes both parents will migrate. So in some areas where we work, you have situations where villages are full of grandparents or much older people and toddlers, but you won't see anybody in their teens or 20s in the village. So this is a picture of a traditional meal on the Altiplano. So you can see there are lots of potatoes. There's thousands and thousands of varieties of potatoes in Bolivia, all sorts of colors and shapes and flavors. So those are the um, yellow potatoes you can see, but the black blobs, they're also potatoes, and that's a type of it's called chuño. And what families do is in May, when it's harvest, they will select the best sized potatoes to make chuño. And in June, when the frosts come, they will lay them out on the ground overnight for 3 nights in a row, and that will freeze dry the potatoes. And then on the fourth day, they will walk barefoot on the potatoes, which will pull some of the skin off. And after that, you're left with these black freeze-dried potatoes, and those can last families for up to 3 or 4 years. Um, it's I do like eating tuna, but it's quite an acquired taste, and it's not something I can really put into words to describe what it tastes like. But alongside potatoes and chuno, families will often have either a bit of salsa, so a sort of liquid mixture of onion and tomato, or something that's more like a salad. So here we can see there's tomato, onion, and a bit of fried egg there. Families will also, if they've got livestock, they'll also make cheese. Families that live near the lake may fish and have a bit of fish. So partners will always they work with families and to explain more about nutrition and make sure that there's good protein in people's diets. A lovely tradition that I wanted to share with you that families on the Altiplano or communities on the Altiplano do is an aptapi. And an aptapi is kind of like what we would call a potluck lunch. So you can see in the bottom right-hand photo, ladies from the families will bring food for everybody to share. So you can see there's potatoes, chuno, there'll usually be broad beans as well, you can see on the left-hand side. That will all be wrapped in a shawl and put down, and everyone will sit down on the floor and share that together. Families will often, the women in the family will often also bring plastic bags to take away leftovers if they can, and they'll often do that if we're doing training courses, so that they've got food to feed their families in the evening or the next day. But the aptapi tradition of everybody sharing together is something really special, and whenever I visit families as part of my work for CAFOD to monitor the projects, to check that it's all going well. Families, if I go to visit, they will always want to provide food. So sometimes that would mean that you'd have to have 4 lunches in one day. And obviously those families are sharing food that's a valuable resource for them with us. So I always ask partners to arrange that we'll do an aptapi. So I take food in the name of CAFOD and all our supporters and our volunteers, and I share with the families. So that means they cook less. It means that we can share food with them, and it's a nice way for me to be able to explain who our supporters are and who all these people are that put so much time and money into CAFOD. So I'd mentioned earlier about water being a problem. The government's done several programs to ensure that people have access to clean drinking water. So in many communities you'll see large tanks that will either fill up with rainwater, or they might be filled up, lorries might come around to fill them up, and then the community will administer how that water's shared out. So most people in our projects do have access to drinking water. Not all of them, but most of them. But when it comes to irrigating crops, or when it comes to livestock, so lots of people have cows, maybe goats, chickens, sheep, they will be drinking from a water source like this puddle here, and obviously that will usually have feces, urine, parasites, all sorts of things in, which is going to affect the livestock and their milk. So our partners do a lot of work to help families. If they have little water sources like this on their land, they'll help them to to pipe them down to a tap on the homestead and help to put in rudimentary filters so that families can have water troughs that will fill with rainwater for their livestock, and families are better able to irrigate their land. This was another photo I wanted to show you about some of the issues that families face there. We took this photo 15 minutes after a hailstorm, and I don't know if you can see, it looks like it snowed all the way from where we're standing up to the top of the hill, but that isn't snow, that's hail, and that came down in 15 minutes, and then that will have taken a day or two to melt away. I don't know if you can see the size of those hailstones; they're quite gigantic. And if your crops are flowering at the wrong moment when the hail comes, then that can kill your crops. So hailstorms can be quite a severe problem for families. So partners will work with families to ensure that they have good strategies so that they don't sow all their crops at the same time of year on the same week or so that they're staggered. So they will help families by building greenhouses, so some crops will be grown indoors so they'll be better protected. There's various things that they'll do to help families to guard against these difficulties. So I preempted myself then. So what is CAFOD doing to help families that are living in this difficult situation? Well, the most important thing is that we're working with 3 partners on the Altiplano to help families grow more food. So we're training, through our partners, we're training communities on traditional and modern farming methods, such as organic fertilizers, compost, seeds, and terracing. So a technique such as terracing, which would help families to conserve the nutritious topsoil on land. That's something that's been done for thousands of years. That's not a new technique. That's something that some of that knowledge has been lost, and so partners are reintroducing that because it's a technique that works well in this region. Other techniques such as making organic fertilizers from materials that people can access, that aren't too expensive and they can easily access, something like that's much more modern. Communities how to construct their own greenhouses, wormeries, vegetable gardens, and drinking troughs. So that's where a lot of the costs in the projects will go towards materials for that. But partners will always be keen for communities to get very involved in the construction and to put in, to maybe help with building the adobe bricks, so that they're learning knowledge and skills that won't vanish once the project has gone. And we see that once families have passed through a project, you see they've got skills and they'll start replicating that of their own accord. We also teach families how to make their own organic fertilizers and pesticides and how to farm efficiently in harmony with the environment. So, and that has 2 benefits. If people are able to make their own fertilizers and pesticides, it means they're not spending the little money they have on buying these products, which can be quite expensive. The families and the communities that we work with in the Altiplano, in Andean culture, there's a very strong link to what they would call Pachamama. So in English that would sort of translate to being Mother Earth. So for example, when we're about to eat food with families, everyone will drop a little bit on the floor and tip a little bit of their drink on the floor, which is to say thank you for the gift of food that they've been given. We also help families to access water sources to irrigate their crops and provide clean water for their livestock. So we're not doing large-scale irrigation systems because there's just not enough funding for that. But the partners will work with each individual family, looking at each individual plot of land to see what sources they've got and what's going to be the most effective techniques and effective mechanisms of enabling that family to irrigate their land well. So there are 3 partners that work on and that we're focusing on for harvest, that work on rural livelihoods. The first is Fundación Nuna, and they're the partner that are working with Nicanora. This is their director, Eva, and she's holding up there. That was a meeting with members of a community. They'd been doing a training session all together, and everybody has the manual that she has in her hands. And so whilst everyone's been trained, they will also have a manual which will help them remember the details of everything they're learning that they can look back on. Another partner that we work with is Sitka. You can see, this is Pasquale who works for Sitka, and you can see in the background there Lake Titicaca, as they work in an area by the lake that's quite near the Peruvian border. And our third partner is called Senda. They're the partner that are more to the east of the Altiplano. The area they work in, or the families they work with, are much higher up. So some are at about 5,000 meters. It's extremely high regions. So we haven't focused on them in lots of the harvest materials because we couldn't go and visit them in January, just because it's too difficult for people recently arrived in Bolivia to suddenly jump in a car and drive up to that kind of altitude. But their work focuses a lot on potatoes and potato seeds, teaching people how to extract their own potato seeds and then go through different generations of growing potatoes. So that's recuperating knowledge that their ancestors would have had. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important for our partners that the families are very involved in the project. In years gone by, some agencies would have arrived in a community and just said, here you go, and we're giving all these things. And so some families and communities had started to have the attitude when you arrived, well, what are you going to give me? And so the partners are working very hard to change that attitude. So the only people involved in projects are people that really, really want to try and transform how they're farming. So families will be expected to put in some kind of resource. So often it will be making these adobe bricks, which can be used for greenhouses. Obviously, if you're the family we're working with are unable to do that, the partner will always find a way round, or make sure that there are enough people involved that can help with the building of the greenhouse. Greenhouses are probably the most popular thing with the families that the partners do. This is a greenhouse being built by our partner Sitka. So to the left is Javier and then Pasquale again. And to the right on the stool is Freddie, this is a large greenhouse that he's building. He's very keen to be able to grow enough food, not just for his family, but to be able to sell. So he lives on his land there with his mother and with his daughter, because unfortunately his wife has passed away. So he's keen to be able to sell enough vegetables so that he can support his daughter through her education. And here's the inside of a greenhouse. This is a small little greenhouse, but you can see it's doing quite well. Those bottles down the middle that are lining the path, they'll be filled with water. And that water will heat up during the day because the temperatures, as I mentioned earlier, can get extremely hot. And then that will maintain heat in that environment as it gets cold at night. Whereas the bottles hanging down will have the tops off, so that water can evaporate because the Altiplano is an extremely arid environment. So that will just help keep that environment there a bit more moist. So when people start with a greenhouse, the first thing they will usually grow is lettuces. And most people will say, well, that doesn't make much sense because a lettuce is not as nutritious as, say, a beetroot. However, a lettuce will grow quite quickly, and everybody knows what to do with a lettuce, and everyone knows what it tastes like, and most people like lettuce. So families will get very excited as lettuces are produced. They're then able to share them with neighbours, they're able to eat them, and then they become more confident about growing different vegetables, and then about learning how to grow, not just grow, but also how to prepare and cook other vegetables. So a couple of families got very enthusiastic and grew pumpkins a few years ago, but what to do with them. So partners will almost always start with lettuces, which will grow quickly. And then other things like tomatoes will be planted at the same time, but lettuces just kind of light the spark that help families move forward. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. So these are wormeries, which I wanted to tell you about because it's something that that people here are likely to know a little bit about. People that like getting they have green fingers. So wormeries, and they're quite quick and easy to build. They cost a little bit because you need to have a good top, a good seal over the top of the wormery that will keep the worms safe. So animal dung will be put in a structure like this that will have been built by the partner, and then worms are brought in. These are Californian worms. They're not indigenous worms because Californian worms will produce an enormous amount of humus in a very short space of time, whereas indigenous worms would actually, or the local worms would actually take a couple of years to produce that kind of quantity. So what a Californian worm would produce in about 3 months, a local worm would take significantly longer. So the animal dung will be put in there. Then the worms will go in, which are provided by the partner, and they will produce a humus, which is extraordinary for enriching the soil, helping plants go. Families, it will once they've tried it once, they'll tend to be very enthusiastic because the quality of the vegetables that it produces massively improves. It's usually used outdoors on outdoor crops rather than in the greenhouses, because outdoors, if any worms kind of escape when they're sown on the land, then natural predators like birds will come along and grab them. Whereas in a greenhouse, you might end up with a huge population of worms which might start munching your crops.
Could I just interrupt you for a second, Vicky?
Of course.
We've got a question. What's hummus?
Sorry, I was trying to be delicate. So it's the worms will eat the animal dung, usually cow dung, and it's the hummus is what they excrete. So it will look a bit like this. You can see the cow dung on the right, and then the hummus is what they've excreted on the left-hand side. So a wormery needs to be, you can see here, they're covering that with straw because you need to make sure that that it doesn't dry out, that the worms are protected from the sun. So people will care quite carefully for their worms. That can also be watered down and sprayed as on crops as they grow. So this is a lady called Christina Mamani. She is in her wormery with some of the worms. You may have seen her. Anybody that might have bought a world gift, because she's she's the lady that features in the photos for the vegetable garden. I met Christina in 2014 for the first time, and I'd like to tell you about her because when I first met her, she reminds me of Nicanora now. She was very, very shy. She had land, but her husband had migrated because they hadn't got any money. She's got 5 children. The one thing she was very determined about was that she wanted her children to be able to have a proper education because she hadn't, and she'd had a very difficult childhood. So she was very clear about that, but apart from that, she didn't really have any ideas about what sort of farming, how she wanted to improve. She made very little eye contact, and just, yes, she got very low self-esteem. And she began with the project in 2014 when I first met her, and I don't know if anybody listening will have been involved in 2012 with the Water Match Fund, where CAFOD supporter, for every £1 a CAFOD supporter gave, DFID, the government, matched it with another £1. Well, as a result of that, we had money for water projects in these areas, and Christina, the partner Nuna, were able to help her with a water tank. So this is her water tank, and I went back to visit her in January. Oh, sorry, this is her vegetable garden at the time. So you can see it's not doing a great deal. There's she's got a little bit of irrigation going on. There's not a lot being grown. certainly not enough to feed a family with 4 children. So when we went back in January, this is her vegetable garden now, which you can see is she's on fire. There's so many things being in this garden. And Christina had changed completely. The transformation was extraordinary. She came out to meet us. She couldn't stop talking. She couldn't stop telling us what she was doing, what she has done, what her plans are for the future. She had, with the support of the project, they had terraced her land. They'd built a greenhouse that she's able to grow vegetables in, enough for the family. On the terracing, she's been growing gladiolis to sell, and then she built herself. She built another greenhouse where and in that she's growing carnations, and with the money from the flowers, she's paying for 2 of her daughters to go to university. So it's been an extraordinary transformation for her, and we've just because for Andean people, their situation, or the people that we're supporting, their situation is so precarious that it's a huge risk for them to try new farming techniques, because if it goes wrong, they might not have any food at the end. And so you can't just arrive, and partners can't arrive and start saying, right, you need to do this, that, and the other. So partners will usually take new families to visit people like Christina, because Christina can explain in Aymara, so in the local language, exactly what worked, what didn't work. She can give them inspiration and motivation. So Nicanora has just been to visit Christina. So we're really hoping that Nicanora is going to go through a similar experience like the one that Christina's had, and that she'll be able to start growing enough food for her family. Another hope that we have with the project, obviously Christina has been selling flowers, but most families to begin with will start off just selling some of the excess vegetables that they're growing. So this photo you can see on the right, this is Juana, Doña Juana, who was selling some of her vegetables for the first time. She's a very determined lady. The men on the left were a little nervous. She now, with the excess vegetables that she grows, she now makes lunches that she sells in the market town. So when families are able to grow enough food, they might come. This is Santa Rosa Market. That's about 5 in the morning. People might, if they've got enough, they might come here on a Thursday or a Friday morning and sell their produce there. And obviously, once they've got more money, they're spending less on pesticides, and they're not buying vegetables because they're growing their own. It just means they've got a lot more opportunities and choices, particularly for families with children that want to make sure they have a good education. But a really important part of the work that our partners do that we've not been able to focus on in the harvest materials, because there's just not enough space really to explain everything. But something that I always want to mention is that within these 3 projects, we work very closely with a certain number of families. Then we work more, so those families may receive greenhouses. They'll have accompaniment from the technical staff. Other families there might not be enough budget, or they're a bit more timid about getting involved. They might just come to training sessions and just try a few new techniques to begin with. Other projects, so the Sender project, that works much more at a community level, so it's working with different communities rather than families. The SIPCA they will do a lot of work around helping communities decide what the local development policies are going to be, or how to influence local development policies. So here we see Johnny and his wife Maria. They're in their that's the clothing that you wear when you're an authority in your community, and so SIPCA work with the authorities. You can see here everybody together. So all the ladies will have their green shawls, the pink skirts, and the men have specific ponchos and scarves. The partners work with these communities to help them identify what would help them at a government level, as a policy, and then teach them how to and accompany them so that they can collaborate with local authorities. So this is Taraco in this area. The authorities, the families were suffering because a lot of cattle was coming over from Peru, but there were no regulations regarding the state of that cattle, so they were bringing all sorts of illnesses over with them, and that was affecting the livestock that everybody in this region had. So they put together a proposal and they went to their local authorities and with a plan for how to go about vaccinating that cattle, and making sure that there was good animal sanitation in the area, and the authorities agreed and took it on, and then financed it in the following financial year. So that type of work is extremely important because it means communities direct their own development at a local level, and that affects everybody in the community, not just the families that are getting very, very direct help with greenhouses and things. So families who've had continued support from our partners, so families such as like Christina, for example, they're now able to grow enough food to feed their families. This is helping to improve their health and nutrition. They're able to earn income and spend less on buying vegetables, seeds, or pesticides. They're able to implement farming techniques that cope with climate change, and they're able to use farming techniques that work in harmony with nature. So that's a very brief overview of the 3 projects that we're focusing on for Harvest. Obviously, these are just the main features, but there's all sorts of complexities in there. There's political complexities and there's technical complexities. There's all sorts of there's mine of information about all these projects. So I've just kind of given you some of the highlights and hopefully some photos that will give you an idea of what it looks like. And I wanted to finish by showing you, this is Joel, who is 2. He's a 2-year-old with his own personal pickaxe, and I wanted to talk to you about Joel because his family have been working with Sitka, our partner, for a few years, and as a result of that project, his father he hardly ever migrates to the city. He's there, and they're a very close family, and I wanted to use that example to say thank you to everybody, because for me there's a really direct line between all the volunteers and all the people that help CAFOD raise funds and Joel and his family, because that wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had any money to help that project unless everybody that supports CAFOD had helped in the way that they do. So I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of Joel and to say thank you. Well, thank you from me, but also thank you from the families, because we are, as I said earlier, I always try to talk to the families about who our supporters are, so that, because sometimes they think it's just governmental or yes, they won't really know where this money's come from for the project. But it's I always try and explain who all our supporters are, and so they're always very thankful. So this is a nice moment where I get to say thank you to all of you listening, because that's all thanks to you. So I'm going to stop there and try and answer questions that might have come in.
Thank you very much, Nikki, for a really wonderful and really interesting presentation. We have a question from Val about the wormeries. She'd like to know how long the worms live for.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually know, generally, because the worms will reproduce between themselves. And that will often be that's why hummus isn't sown indoors, because often the eggs will be sown. You'd see a worm and take that out if you were sowing hummus on your crops inside in a greenhouse, but you obviously wouldn't see the eggs. So that's why they do that. So no, I'm afraid I don't know, but I'm listing all the questions that come in, as I have a feeling there's lots that I won't know the answer to. So I'll be able to share the answers with Ellie.
Fulvio's just been doing some worm research, and he tells me they live for 10 years.
Oh.
It's quite a long time for a worm, I think.
Yes.
So yeah, another question we had was around the men migrating, and the question is, what kind of effect? I think you touched on this when you were talking about Joel, about the effect that it has on women and the family.
It has a huge effect because women, once a man migrates from the village, that means that the woman in the family is looking after, so she's doing her usual day looking after the children, cooking, cleaning, but she's now also farming the same size land, but on her own. So something that before needed two adults, she's now doing that on her own. And looking after children. But communities in Bolivia, or in this area, once you're married, you're then expected to take on roles of authority, and that's a very serious responsibility that people have within the community. And a couple is given a task. It's so a couple will be the husband and wife will be expected to take on the authority role. So if the man isn't there, then she will need to do that herself on her own. So she'll have three areas of responsibility that she has to deal with daily, just the cooking, cleaning, all that type of thing, looking after children, the actual farming, and then community responsibilities. Also, you tend to find some of the women, when their husbands have migrated, tend to be a bit bullied within the community, which can make life very difficult for them.
Thank you very much. And another question is about the idea of recuperating knowledge to do with farming techniques. And the question is this something that lots of agencies have been encouraging? Has it been going on for a long time, or is it a relatively new technique?
Um, I've encountered it occasionally. Um, Occasionally, it's not something that's hugely common in Bolivia that I've seen. So I'm aware that what I'm saying that might it's just from what I've lived and where I've been and what I've seen. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening. But yeah, there's quite a few. A lot of the partners that do this sort of work are very keen and do have that kind of perspective that bringing back a lot of the knowledge and techniques that people's ancestors would have used. There's a lot of value in that because they help people live on that terrain for thousands of years. So there is a lot of value in it. But like I said, it's convincing. People need to be convinced that this isn't going to be a huge risk for them. They need to see that it's going to work.
Yeah. And just a question from Therese, also worm related. She would like to know if introducing Californian worms poses any risk to native biology.
hmm Yes, no, that was something that I'd been worried about. But our partners have actually been doing this. SIPCA have been doing wormeries for 10 years, and they haven't seen any problems as a result of bringing in the Californian worms. Where it's something that everybody's very conscious of. They will usually try and prioritize native crops. For example, quinoa that people might grow. Something like that. It's something we're all very conscious of could have a negative effect because it's something, not worms, but for example, in those areas, in years gone by, some projects, not CAFOD ones, other ones have come in and decided to try and plant lots of different trees that weren't indigenous, and that's caused huge problems because they suck up a lot more water than native trees. So it's an issue. We're not seeing any problems, but it's something that everybody is very conscious of that could that they keep an eye on.
Thank you very much.
I've been emailing somebody called Therese today, so if you are that Therese, then hello, and I look forward to being in contact.
Thanks. And just to go back to the question that we had before, Mike would like to know how did the traditional knowledge get lost that you're reintroducing?
Um, I don't have a concrete answer. I mean, when we talk to partners about this, they'll all have different ideas about it. I think part of the problem is migration, and particularly of young people. So if young people have stayed in their communities, when they reach about 18 or so, they don't have their own land, and land in these areas is all inherited according to quite strict laws, and so there's not really anything that they can do to earn money, so they can't buy any land, so they will usually migrate to cities. Um, so, or they may have migrated to cities if they're when they were in their early teens, so they won't have been learning. They won't have been learning good farming techniques as they grow up with their parents. So that's what I think the migration and people moving around has had a big impact on knowledge being lost, um, and it just is quite corrosive of social fabric generally, not just in terms of using changing farming techniques. Also, I think there's a perception that if it's new and shiny, it must be better. So whilst people are generally a bit cautious about trying new things, I think if a new pesticide appears or if people um, see things that their neighbours are doing, particularly if their neighbours have migrated a lot, or particularly if they've lived abroad and come back, then they might assume that because it's foreign, it's better. I think there's a little bit of that goes on as well.
Thank you very much. And our final question, I think it's our final question, is from Carmel. And she asks that she knows that not all CAFOD's projects flourish to the point of being sustainable. And how do you work to ensure that the people helped will be able to continue without CAFOD support?
Mm-hmm. Um, so large amounts of the lots and lots of elements within all three projects are focused on training, so and sharing as much knowledge as possible, and on building so people. Once they've learned best ways, for example, of building irrigation ditches on their land, that's not going to, that knowledge is there, they'll have learned something that they can keep. The projects also try and build quite a lot of social fabric, so families helping other families, so there's support there. When a partner starts in a new area, they'll go around and first they'll speak to the authorities and to get permission to work with families there. They'll speak with families will tell them what their big needs are. So the project will always be based on whatever the family's biggest needs are. But the people that get involved at first are the people they'll be in an awful situation, but they're the bravest. So they're going to take a chance. Whereas if we're going to work with the people that are the most vulnerable, we need to work with the next layer of people. So projects will usually last in a region. Most partners will have a 10-year plan. And so in the first few years, you're working with families with the most oomph, the most get up and go. And then the next wave will be families that have been too timid or too poor to be able to, or not too poor, they're just too difficult for them to try and get involved, and they will come in the second wave, and that's always a real sign that a project's going well, or really serving those families and those communities when that group of people decide that they want to get really involved. Another sign that we see is that families sometimes won't wait to get involved in a project. They will have seen what their neighbours are doing. They'll have maybe they might have come to a training. They might have gotten hold of a manual, and they'll start replicating techniques on their own. And that's when you know that all that really good knowledge, all those skills, all the techniques have kind of they've grown wings, and they're now flying around. And that's always really, really positive thing to see. So that's very specific in terms of how, in terms of the techniques that people are learning for their farming. I think the other thing is the work that the partners do with the local authorities, not the authorities, sorry, the authorities. So because you're teaching communities how they can relate and collaborate with the state, and so they can then direct what policies they want, what changes they want, what they'd like the state to invest in their areas. For example, it wouldn't be CAFOD's or our partner's job to organise electricity for a village. But the partners, if that's the problem, they will teach the authorities and accompany them and help them so that they can go to this local municipal council and say, right, we need electricity here. And work on a plan together. So that has far-reaching effects. Again, they're skills that people don't lose, and you see lots of people who are now mayors. They've now got slightly higher roles in local council that initially these projects. So that's always another positive sign.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you again for joining us and giving us such a wonderful insight into CAFOD's work in Bolivia. And I would also like to say a massive thank you to everyone who has worked on Harvest Fast Day last weekend and who has plans for this weekend as well, for everyone who's spoken at Mass, for everyone who's organised a collection, everyone who's organised a soup lunch or an event for CAFOD's Harvest Fast Day. As Nikki said, then obviously without your support, CAFOD's work wouldn't be able to happen at all. So we're really very grateful, and we ask you to keep Nick and Nora and all of the people that CAFOD works with in your prayers. I'd also just like to take this chance to highlight a way that you can make your Harvest Fast Day gift go further through gift aid. So if you are a taxpayer, CAFOD will be able to reclaim the basic rate of tax on any gift that you make, meaning that we'll receive an extra 25 pence for every £1 that is given. And if you are planning to hold a collection in your parish, we'd like to ask you if you could please encourage your fellow parishioners to complete a gift aid declaration and share the great news about gift aid in your parish. We will be sending a link to our gift aid form in the email that follows this webinar. So thank you again very much. We will be sharing this webinar with you afterwards, and you are most welcome to send it to anyone you think will be interested. If you have any other questions, please just do send us them in an email, and we'll make sure that we pass them on and get an answer for you. Any other resources you would like for Harvest Fast Day are available on the CAFOD website, so that's cafod.org.uk/fastday. And if you are holding a soup lunch or anything and you take any photographs, we'd love to see them. Please send them to us at stories@cafod.org.uk. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you again at another webinar very soon in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.